Welcome and hello. You are here at This Week in Washington. This is Independent Sector's policy update on COVID-19 response and recovery and the nonprofit charitable sector. I'm Ben Kershaw, the Director of Public Policy and Government Relations at IS. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. We're a national membership organization representing a diverse set of nonprofits, foundations, and corporate giving programs working to ensure that all people in the U.S. thrive. Part of our webinar feature, your lines are muted. We'll pause for questions. You can submit them at any time through the Q&A box, or you can email publicpolicy@independentsector.org. This webinar will be recorded. The slides will be available. And it'll be posted on the IS website, and it'll be emailed to you, I believe, early next week. Before we start, I want to respectfully acknowledge I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C., the ancestral home of the Piscataway people who are still in the area working to reclaim their land and their traditional practices. I also want to acknowledge many of the buildings and the places we inhabit in Washington were built with the labor of enslaved people. Wherever you are joining us from, we're really glad to have you with us today. These sorts of policy education events are historically a member benefit of Independent Sector. During the pandemic, we have given access to anyone who is interested in them and would benefit from them. If you enjoy them and want to keep working with us, boy, would we love to have you as a member of the IS community. I'm joined today by my intrepid colleague, Ana Montañez, and our trusted partner, Wes Coulomb, with Washington Counsel Ernst & Young. I'm also joined by our special guest, Chelsea Newhouse, a communications associate for the Johns Hopkins Center for Civil Society Studies. Chelsea has some interesting data and important new data to present to us today. So in lieu of our government relations update, which we will move to in a few minutes, I want to start by thanking Chelsea and the folks at the Center for Civil Society Studies for their long work on nonprofit data issues. And I'm going to turn things over to Chelsea now after I introduce her. So Chelsea currently manages the center's nonprofit economic data project, its nonprofit works interactive database, and its philanthropication through privatization project. She oversees all aspects of center communications, and she also works closely with Center Director Lester Solomon on a wide range of other initiatives that honestly are too numerous to list here. We only have a half hour today. And so I want to, again, thank Chelsea for joining us and turn it over to her for some of the latest and most important data on the nonprofit sector. Thanks for being here, Chelsea. Good to have you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be able to share some of this data. So first, I think what I'm going to do is just give you a quick overview of the data that we work with, and then go into a broad picture of the nonprofit sector's economic role as an employer based on the latest available data. We then took that available data and tried to come up with a baseline estimate of what the job losses resulting from the COVID crisis might mean for the sector in terms of employment. And I'll get into that towards the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen here because I have slides. All right. So for quick background, the Nonprofit Economic Data Project has been working with nonprofit employment and wage data for 20 years now. Actually, our very first report was released in 2000 on Maryland. Today, in the past decade or so, we've been using a fairly unique set of data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's out of the quarterly census of employment and wages. And the reason that we use that instead of 990 data to get a picture of nonprofit employment is there's two huge advantages to this data set. First of all, it is comparable The QC data are gathered on all sectors of the economy in the same way using the North American Industry Classification System. This then allows us to make apples to apples comparisons between nonprofit institutions and their for-profit counterparts working in the same fields. And it also allows us to look at other BLS data sets and make valid comparisons without having to crosswalk or do any other manipulation of the data. And the second major advantage of the QCW data over 990s and other data sources is that it is gathered on the establishment level and not the organizational level. What this means is that we can actually see exactly where nonprofits are performing work, where those jobs are based, and to a certain extent where the wages are being paid, and avoid distortions that can arise through 990 type data sets where all jobs are attributed to the jurisdiction in which headquarters is located. The establishment level data also separates out different parts of an organization that are doing different kinds of work under the NAICS classification system. So if you've got, for instance, a homeless services agency that operates both a shelter and consignment shop, you get both of those and they're properly classified. So that's why we use the QCW data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is now releasing these data on a 5-year rolling basis or 5-year basis. And they just released some in 2019, covering up through 2017. So that's the data I'm going to be looking at. That's the most recent available. So what do they tell us about the nonprofit sector in terms of employment and wages? First of all, big top line thing to understand is that the nonprofit sector together is the 3rd largest workforce in the US. It is behind only retail, trade, and accommodation and food services. And as of 2017, it actually exceeds all branches of manufacturing combined. So those 12.5 million nonprofit workers actually represents about 10.4% of the paid workforce in the US. So what we know from this is that more than 1 in 10 of every private worker in the US is employed by a nonprofit organization. That makes it a hugely important part of our economy. And obviously they pay wages to these workers. How much? In 2017, the nonprofit sector paid over $670 billion in wages, also making it the 3rd largest payroll in the US. This time behind manufacturing and professional and technical services, both very high wage fields. But one of the things that you notice here is that one of the fastest growing fields, retail trade, even though it employs 3.3 million more workers around the US than nonprofits, they paid 177 billion less in wages in 2017. So that brings up an important point that a lot of people have been hand-wringing about, and that is, does the growth of nonprofit jobs lead to lower wage jobs? Does it push wages down? And surprisingly, what these data reveal is the answer is no. In 2017, nonprofits paid 97 cents on the dollar compared to the whole for-profit sector taken together. And more importantly, as nonprofits grow, the better paying jobs in the main fields of operation grow as well. As you can see here, nonprofits pay significantly better wages than their for-profit counterparts in all but 3 of the fields in which they're concentrated. Those 3 fields stand out a little bit because, first of all, they are not service providing fields. And secondly, the arts and recreation field, what's called arts and recreation here is arts, entertainment, and recreation. And that includes things like professional sports and television and film production. So that's those three fields where nonprofits do not pay wages equivalent or higher than their for-profit counterparts are a little bit of outliers. So like I said earlier, this pretty much debunks this longstanding perception that nonprofit jobs are poorly compensated jobs, which is an important point because nonprofit jobs have been growing faster than for-profit jobs for at least the past decade. In particular, between 2007 and 2017, nonprofit employment growth outpaced the for-profit sector by a factor of 3 to 1. And that was especially apparent during the last major economic downturn that we suffered after the 2008 financial crisis. As you can see on the far left of this figure, where nonprofits grew during that period by 8.5%, while for-profits contracted by 4.1%. And that's not just national or not just concentrated in specific states. It's actually all but 4 states in Puerto Rico exceeded the for-profit rate. And in 28 of the states and territories for which data are available, the nonprofit average growth rate actually exceeded this impressive 18.6%. So nonprofits are a huge counter-cyclical force to economic downturns and whatnot, which is an important thing to keep in mind as we move into the period that we are moving into. So, keeping all of this in mind, we started looking for ways to figure out how COVID-19 shutdowns and other economic impacts are hitting the nonprofit sector. Unfortunately, the BLS do not release their monthly employment situation reports with nonprofits pulled out. So what we did is we looked at their reports and applied a formula based on the percent of each field's workers who work for nonprofits as of 2017, again, the latest year for which we have the data. And what we found as of May was that the nonprofit sector had likely lost over 1.6 million employees during that time, which represented about 13% of the total nonprofit workforce. So that was a huge blow. Since May, during the recovery period, they've gained back approximately 666,000 workers, but that still leaves them missing almost 1 million workers in their overall workforce. As you can see, it's not been even between the major fields of nonprofit activity, neither job losses initially nor the recovery. So we took a look at that, and this figure shows the 8% of jobs, all nonprofit jobs, are still missing. But there are some fields that are particularly still harder hit. So obviously arts and recreation stands out here. Unfortunately, the BLS reports don't provide much in terms of subfields so that we can look very closely at those fields where nonprofits actually do operate to separate them out from things like professional sports and television and film production, things like that. But they are still down 38% of their employees overall. So that is something we need to keep a very close eye on as reopening starts to happen and see, you know, are these jobs permanently lost? Are they going to come back? The other thing that stood out to us here really was the social assistance field. And fortunately, the BLS did break down those data by subfields, which allows us to see where social assistance organizations are recovering and where they're lagging seriously behind, keeping them still down 12%. So this is what we found. Fortunately, some of the critical organizations right now, community food, housing, emergency and relief services, have gained back almost all of their losses since May. But the real outlier here is child daycare services. Huge problem considering how important these organizations are going to be in terms of letting parents get back to work, providing childcare during remote learning periods, and that is something we need to keep a very close eye on. So we have this baseline. The problem is, like I said, the BLS is not pulling out nonprofit data, so that we have currently no real way to compare how nonprofits specifically are recovering versus the for-profit sector, their for-profit counterparts in the same fields, which makes it difficult to assess how much the existing and future support mechanisms are providing the needed help to these organizations. So there are two options there. Either BLS starts reporting the nonprofit jobs separately monthly like they do for the private sector as a whole, or we need to get them to release, to move up their release schedule for the full nonprofit employment and wage data set, which is currently they do not plan to release those data until 2024. And what that means is that we will not be able to see where nonprofits were at the start of the pandemic or where they were after the pandemic for several years. And that's going to make it incredibly difficult to assess the policy implications and support. So one thing that people can do to push the BLS to start treating nonprofits like they do other industries is to submit a request through the BLS data request line, which is at that link right there, letting them know that these are useful and that they should be treating the third largest employer the same way they treat every other industry. And that's pretty much it. I think I stayed under my time. And then there's just a bunch of our resources if you want to explore the data further, including the Nonprofit Works website, which Ben mentioned, and that you can go in and find county level, state level, national level data on all sorts of fields from 1991 to 2016, and that's about to be updated to include MSA level data as well through 2017. So that's it.
Thank you, Chelsea. I know there's a lot more information you could provide us. So thank you for this really helpful overview. We would welcome a question or two for Chelsea in the Q&A box. I see we have some activity over there already. So while we give folks a second, Chelsea, you mentioned that it's going to be until 2024 when the next round of this data comes out. Surely there aren't other smaller subsectors that are going to have their data released before then, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Pretty much the BLS releases at least annual data on pretty much every field. Now, those do include nonprofits, but they're not pulled out and there's no way for us to identify them. So, for instance, I think there's quarterly reports on manufacturing, mining, you know, much smaller fields.
All right, that doesn't seem fair. Okay.
No, we agree.
Great. Well, Chelsea, if you can stick around, folks we'll loop back again at the end to see if folks have further questions. Thank you again. I want to now turn to Wes Coulomb with Washington counsel Ernst & Young, who is always tracking the latest happenings, and these days not happenings, on Capitol Hill. You know, Wes, the charitable sector is at a critical juncture in need of assistance. You know, we've had negotiations on and off. I know there's been recent activity on the Hill on COVID negotiations. Can you give us a snapshot of where negotiations stand this hour?
This hour, good question, Ben. There's been some activity last, say, week and a half or so. It was quiet for a while there during August. Then the Senate Republicans came back last week and put on the floor a targeted or skinny package, $500 billion or so, to have some provision in there to address the COVID crisis. Not as far as many wanted to go, but basically it was a compromise within the Republicans, who many don't want to have more spending, and some want to do a bigger package, and tried to, Senator Leonard McConnell trying to kind of find the sweet spot with the votes, which he accomplished to get 52 votes out of 53 votes in the Senate Republicans, but obviously didn't pass because no Democrats voted for it, and so kind of still at a stalemate from that standpoint. One thing I'll point out with the bill the Republicans put on the floor last week, really just had expansions of PPP to include a second round for smaller entities to get another PPP loan, not have as many bells and whistles of what the HEROES Act did in the House, or what they put out in July, the HEALS Act the Republicans put forth as a draft proposal, did not have a vote on that, which had more expansive modifications to PPP, other programs for nonprofits that would have been helpful. But they did, the targeted proposal I had last week did have a couple of things in there that I will make note of. And one was a movement on the charitable deduction to increase the current $300 above line deduction that was in the CARES Act to $600 for individuals and $1,200 for a married filing joint filer. So a positive movement on that, even though the bill didn't go anywhere, but hopefully set a standard for negotiations. And if they get to a final package, that will be what they look to as a provision for charitable contributions in there. Obviously, it'd be great to have more than that, but I think that's definitely progress from where we are in the CARES Act. It also had about $15 billion in child care block grant funding for child care providers, and some other spending there for vaccines and healthcare workers. So that's kind of where things were last week. And now the question is what are they going to do going forward? Are they going to engage on conversations? It was fairly quiet until yesterday. The president made some news by saying he wanted Republicans to, agree to more funding, not specify a number. Then this morning, Chief of Staff Meadows indicated they would be willing to go up to 1.5 trillion above their $1 trillion number. Obviously not as high as what the Democrats in the House wanted. Pelosi's response was, we're still stuck at our $2.2 trillion number for their package. And so there's some movement, but not quite enough in my view to get them to really negotiate serious details on a package. So, they don't have a deadline tomorrow. They really have to get something done, really leave town for the elections, which is scheduled to be, the end of session is kind of scheduled to be October 2nd. They do have the CR that expires on September 30th. They're trying to work out an extension of the budget resolution through sometime in December, could be December 11th, December 18th, is kind of the dates I've heard bantied about for those conversations. And if they can get agreement on the CR and then get serious about moving between the two parties on a number and on a package on COVID relief between now and October 2nd, then that would be helpful for the sector to get something in there. A lot of people are negative about them being able to bridge that divide, which has been pretty broad. It's getting a little bit narrower, but still, 1.5 between 1.5 and 2.2 is still, is still a little bit of a difference. Maybe they can bridge that that divide and reach a proposal. You also had the problem solvers caucus in the House. Congressman Reed and Gottheimer put out a proposal with about 50 Republicans and Democrats to also about a $1.5 trillion package that they put out as well in recent days that had similar proposals from both the House Democrats and Senate Republicans versions of the bill. Going to help stimulate some bipartisan conversations. I think there's a desire amongst some of the more moderate Democrats in the House to push Pelosi to get a deal and not be so stubborn on the higher number, just reach an agreement. There's also a handful of Republicans in the Senate who are in tough races. I think who are interested in getting a deal and want McConnell and the administration to reach an agreement. You do still have a number of Republicans in the Senate who are pretty much no for anything or anything that's very large. And so they're going to lose some votes there. But the question in my mind is, can they find a sweet spot where they have enough Democrats in the House and then enough Republicans in the Senate to pass something through? No question it'll lose members on both sides. If there's a package of, say, 1.7 or 1.9, somewhere in that neighborhood between the two sides. And so the question is, can they get that done between now and the end of the month, first part of October? A lot of people are pessimistic that can happen, but I think the movement of the last couple of days have kind of shown there's still some momentum, still some movement. And so it's not quite totally dead yet.
Got it. Thank you. Really stellar overview in a few minutes, Wes. Thank you. So you mentioned the Problem Solvers Caucus, and so that just as reference, right? That is a bipartisan caucus of sort of some of the most moderate members of the House from both parties. Their bill, right? You mentioned it's smaller, $1.5 trillion. It does include some things that the nonprofit sector is closely watching. It includes some, albeit insufficient, funding for election assistance. It includes in the range of $12 billion for broadband assistance. It includes some census language. It doesn't include charitable deduction expansion. Any other highlights of the contents of that package, Wes, that you would flag?
State and local government funding is in there. That's been a sticking point. The Republicans did not include that in the Senate version. That's really one of the major items of disagreement between the House and the Senate administration on that. They did have some funds in there, which I thought was interesting to show some bipartisan support for that, which I think is going to have to be in a final product if they do have a deal. You mentioned the election aid in there, child care funding, school funding, expansion of the PPP in there for a second round of loans, expand that program as well. Also a targeted employee retention tax credit in there that the sector also can take advantage of, and some modifications to the Main Street lending program was in that package. So a lot of good things in there at a more modest cost than what the House Democrats passed. It doesn't seem to be enough. Speaker Pelosi and some of her chairman kind of came out negative against it. I think it was because it was not as big as what she wanted to do. I think it did help, stir the conversation a little bit more. Then with the House, with the conversation or comments today of the administration, they come up to 1.5 trillion. Maybe those activities can spur some more negotiations.
Great, thank you. Questions from the audience? Q&A box, please. If you have them, about the landscape, about the contents of the proposals you've heard, or about any of the very important yet alarming data that Chelsea shared with us.
Wes, I have a question. So there's been a disaster tax relief bill, right, introduced in the Senate. And I mean, I don't know, seeing that movement, and probably some like a copy of this will probably be introduced in the House. Probably not the same provisions. But that makes me kind of hopeful that this is gonna go somewhere. Maybe this will get attached into a bigger package. I mean, should we be hopeful that something's gonna happen? And there are some of our provisions that could probably right into that, or this is just like an alienated, bill that is just gonna sit there?
Good question. Yeah, Chairman Grassley, Senator Ernst, Senator Cassidy, Senator Feinstein, and possibly one other, I can't remember the other member, introduced a bill in the Senate to provide some tax relief for disaster areas. Obviously, there's been some hurricanes as well as the wildfires out west. There was a derecho and tornado in the Midwest in Iowa, and then obviously there's could be more to come. So that provision of that bill was introduced by them, provides some employment retention tax credits for infected employers in those areas. Also, it would impact the charitable deduction. Since the AGI limits were waived in the CARES Act for this year, it wouldn't deal with those directly, but would allow corporations to have a higher limitation for their contributions for 2020 in disaster-related giving. Now, my sense is that given that the interests, particularly Chairman Grassley and others, that if there's a tax title or a tax bill that moves through as part of a COVID package or part of the CR or otherwise, I think this is a good chance of being added to that. It's not very costly, and a lot of members support it, and it's been traditional. They try to do some tax relief for disaster areas on a regular basis when they do have disasters, and so there's broad support for that, and it should be tacked on to any tax title. I don't think it's going to go by itself alone, but if there is a larger package moving through, I think they're going to try to attach it to that.
And on that bill, right? Non-profit employees are not part of the employees who could benefit from the provision, right?
In the past, they have not been qualified. I don't think they changed that, but traditionally they have not.
Thank you.
So Wes, you mentioned, and I know we're a couple minutes over. We have a couple minutes if folks are able to stay on. We're glad to have your interest. You mentioned December 18th as a potential date if we get a deal or if we don't. For December 18th is the date for the continuing resolution. At which point, right, we've heard from sources on the Hill that certainly December will be a time when we look at tax extenders. And so we have one question about kind of what are the tax extenders this year that could be kind of big enough to pull along a train. Right now, we have one of great interest in the $300 charitable deduction expiring at the end of this year. But certainly I know there's always a lot of others. I know Wes has a lot of experience on extenders, right, from some of your other work.
I do. I've been involved in the extender debate for a long time, back with R&D and other provisions, and doing some work on WOTC this time go around. So there is several provisions that are out there. WOTC, Work Opportunity Tax Credit. It's a higher incentive for employers to hire individuals from unemployment ranks, or those who use SNAP, or they're on food stamps, or they're formerly incarcerated individuals. There's also New Markets Tax Credit, the tax credit for investments in low-income areas. You also have a handful of renewable energy provisions in there. Two provisions that were kind of extended longer term last go around was a biodiesel credit, as well as a credit for short line railroads that both Chairman Grassley and Senator Crapo cared a lot about. But there's still, I think that there's enough interest in extenders broadly. There's about 25 provisions or so, I haven't counted of late, but between 20 and 30 left that expire this year. For traditional group that need to get done by the end of this year. There's also, as you point out, a lot of new provisions that were part of the CARES Act that expire at the end of this calendar year, including the charitable deduction at $300 per filer. That is also expiring this year, and so that will become a new mix of new items that need to be extended or be at least addressed in December. They don't do another COVID package between now and the election, that will come into play as part of that conversation. Now, let's hope they do it at the end of the year. In past experience, they've allowed extenders to expire and go past their effective date and then go back and do it retroactively, which obviously is bad business and bad way to do things, but it's kind of the nature of the beast and what they've done in the past. But hopefully they'll be able to deal with it in December, and they'll have a package. They don't get it done between now and the election, which I don't think extenders are going to be part of that conversation. It's more of a December exercise. It will be hopefully done in December.
Excellent, thank you. Let me pause one moment to see if there are further questions. If not, there's one thing I'd like to just flag for folks as we think about some of the data that Chelsea shared with us today. The trend line of nonprofit jobs from the most recent update to this one is a positive trajectory, right? Nonprofits appear to have gained back some of their lost jobs. And so, I'm worried, and Chelsea, maybe you have thoughts on this, that policymakers look at that and think, well, things are moving in the right direction, right? Maybe by the time we come back in December, they'll be back and they'll all be good. And I just think that line of thinking, which we have heard about, job losses in, getting softened, just so fundamentally misunderstands the role of the nonprofit sector in responding to this crisis. Those jobs that were lost at nonprofit educational services providers, those are educational services that, students have missed. You only learn to read in first grade once. And so some of these are, just lost opportunities that we can never get back. They're not movie theaters that didn't get a chance to open. So, I don't know if, Chelsea, you have a further perspective on, how that data looks and what it tells us about the work of the sector.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of insight into that because, like I said, the data that we're analyzing are for the economy as a whole. So what we're doing is just estimating, assuming that all things are created equal in terms of job losses and job recoveries. What does that mean for the nonprofit sector? And unless we can get nonprofit specific data out of BLS and other sources, then it's going to be very difficult to quantify that. It's at this point, it's impossible to know if nonprofit educational institutions are rehiring at a quicker rate than for-profit educational institutions or vice versa. And I think that is the message that I would take away, is that we need to know more about nonprofits, how they've, including the PPP loan data. We need to be able to get a better view of the nonprofits on the field level from that, to really understand where the impacts have been and where they've been lacking. Yeah, it's an open question, and one of the side effects of our government not treating nonprofits as important employers as an important part of our economy, that needs to be highlighted and supported the same way that other industries are.
Thank you. So with that, I want to again thank Chelsea. I want to thank the Johns Hopkins Center for Civil Society Studies. I want to thank Anna and Wes, as always, and the whole team at IS. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon and for continuing to work with us for this vital sector year round. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.